This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This episode is sponsored by gardencourses.com. Gardencourses.com offers online horticultural training for those looking to develop their own home gardens. There are 3 courses available online this month: Small Space, Big Harvest, Creating an Urban Wildlife Garden, and 4 Seasons of Colour in Your Garden. Go to gardencourses.com to find out more. This episode I'm speaking to Professor Jeff Ollerton, author of the brilliant new book Pollinators and Pollination, another must-have to add to your ever-burgeoning reading pile, I'm afraid. I love the book, and as you'll hear during the interview, it threw up all sorts of interesting questions about pollinators, their role in our lives and gardens, and how much we need them. Jeff was really generous with his time and knowledge, and if you enjoy this interview half as much as I enjoyed recording it, you are in for a treat. So my first question is, and I think maybe it's not as straightforward as you might think, what is a pollinator?
That's a great question, and it often isn't a straightforward answer to describe what a pollinator is, and I think to really understand what a pollinator is, you've got to kind of step back and think about the plants themselves. And plants, unlike most animals, don't move around to find mates. And so in order to engage in sexual reproduction, they actually have to bring in what we term a pollen vector, something that moves pollen around from one flower to another. And for some plants, that could be wind. So anybody who suffers from hay fever knows that a significant proportion of our plants in this country are wind pollinated. And for some water inhabiting plants, it could be water currents that are moving the pollen around, and there's a few species that do that. But for the vast majority of plants, it's actually animals like insects, but also in the tropics, things like birds and bats and so on, that act as pollinators. And they're moving the pollen, the pollen which contains the male sex cells from one flower to another, and enabling those plants to reproduce. So that in a nutshell is what a pollinator is. We could unpack that a lot further and talk about the different groups of pollinators. We're all familiar with bees, but actually there's a much wider diversity of pollinators out there, ranging from everything from flies to butterflies to moths to birds and bats, which I mentioned, but also lizards, rodents, some monkeys act as pollinators, and even cockroaches in some parts of the world.
So I was going to say, apart from being nice to look at, why would gardeners want pollinators to visit their gardens? I'm not sure about the cockroaches being nice to look at. But apart from that, the majority of them, I think, are quite popular. But yeah, what benefit do they bring to gardeners?
Well, the cockroaches don't pollinate in this country. They're mainly tropical. There's some examples from Asia and South America as well. What benefits they bring? I think. Let's not just dismiss the idea that they're just nice to look at. I mean, that I think that is an important thing. I mean, who doesn't like to see butterflies and bumblebees and so on in their garden? But from a purely practical perspective, anybody who's grown things like runner beans in their garden, or apples, or other top fruit, or raspberries, for example, knows just how important it is to have bees in particular visiting those flowers and pollinating them. You don't get a decent crop from many of our insect-pollinated vegetables and fruit unless you've got those pollinators coming into the garden. But also for gardeners who want to save the seeds from annual plants, for example, to propagate them again next year. Bringing pollinators into your garden is going to be important for many of those plants as well.
One of the experiments that you do in the book, and there are many interesting ones, but I was interested in the one where you go into the field and you cut the heads off of the scabious flowers. And I think what you found was that removing the sources of nectar from many of the flowers didn't actually mean that there was a scarcity of food for the pollinators who regularly visited that site. So from that, could you extrapolate that actually more flowers wouldn't lead necessarily to an increase in pollinator numbers? It would just mean that there was more food kind of across the area.
Yeah, it's interesting that you picked up on that experiment. Actually, it was the first time that anything like that had ever been attempted, and I recruited a group of students who helped me out with that. And in one day, we hand pulled 14,500 flower heads from those flowers. I mean, we didn't get rid of the plants; we just removed the flower heads, and they regrew. We had permission from the Wildlife Trust to do it, but we calculated that actually the 14.5 flower heads of field scabious amounts to half a litre of nectar per day. I mean, it's an enormous amount of nectar. For most flowers, nectar is measured in microliters. And yeah, you're absolutely right. What happened was that it made absolutely no difference to the number of pollinators on the site. All of the bees and butterflies and hoverflies just moved on to the next most abundant plant on the site and took nectar from there. So yeah, that probably is telling us that there's enough nectar at that particular site at that particular time to accommodate all of those pollinators. But if we'd done it on another site, we might have had very different results. But I think in terms of attracting different kinds of pollinators, it's diversity of flowers which is important rather than abundance of flowers. So if you fill your garden with one particular type of flower, only those insects that can access the nectar or access the pollen, if they're pollen collecting bees, on those flowers, will be able to visit the flowers and will be attracted to the garden. Whereas if you have 100 different types of flowers, you get many more different types of pollinators in the garden. So I think it's a balance. You've got to have sufficient numbers of each different type of flower to make it worthwhile that the insects actually come and visit those flowers. But you don't want to fill your garden with just one or two different flowers.
Yes, and again, you mentioned the structure of different flowers and the different types of pollinators that they attract. And one of the things that you mentioned in the book, which I found really interesting as well, was the very dark floret in the middle of the white head of a wild carrot flower, and nobody really knows why it's there. But if it is redundant, if it was kind of, I think it's assumed it's redundant and it maybe had a use historically. But if it was redundant, would we find species across the wild where it no longer occurs? And is that the case?
Yeah. Again, interesting that you picked up on that example. So it was Charles Darwin actually, writing in the middle of the 19th century, who first, looked at wild carrot flower heads in detail, and as you say, there's this very dark, modified flower in the middle of the flower head, and he speculated about what its function might be and suggested that it may not have any function now. It might be an evolutionary hangover from a time when it did have a function. And yeah, back in the early 2000s, we did some experiments where we added artificial purple flowers to the heads, or remove them, and so on. And it made absolutely no difference to visits by insects or seed set of those flare heads. There are, so if you go into a population of wild carrots anywhere in Britain, you'll find a proportion that have the dark central floret and a proportion that don't have that floret. And that proportion varies. In some populations, almost none of the plants have it, and in other populations, all of them have it, and in others, half of them will have it and half of them won't. And that's the same across Europe, where the plant is it's native over a large area. So that's probably also evidence that there's no real function to this. Just some plants have it and some plants don't. It's a difficult one to really come to a conclusion on, because I think the experiments of the kind that we conducted need to be done in more parts of the world, across the natural range of wild carrot. There's been a few other, since we published that work in 2000, there's been a few other studies done, like that Dave Goulson, who's some of your listeners probably will be familiar with. He's done some work with some students in Portugal, and they suggested that perhaps the dark central flower was actually mimicking some beetles which were visiting the inflorescences. But I think it's a really good example of how quite a common plant that's familiar in grasslands across Europe still has a story to tell us. There's still mysteries there about how it reproduces and how its flowers have evolved. And that's true across the flowering plants. There's 350,000 species of flowering plants out there, and my best estimate is that we've got some kind of information about the pollinators, but perhaps 10% of those, and less than 1% have been studied in any real detail. So there's still lots to discover.
Yeah, I think that's what drew me to that, actually, because it is a bit of an unknown, and like you say, it's so easy to see an example of it. And I think that a lot of gardeners have been taught, maybe across the years, that actually that is a guide for pollinators, that dark floret. But kind of thinking about other guides that pollinators might use, I found it fascinating that you spoke about how some pollinators navigate via linear features in a landscape. And I wondered what that meant for plants that were situated near these features.
Yeah, that was work that one of my former PhD students, Louise Crimer, did some time ago now. And what she found was that if you follow the behavior of bumblebees and butterflies and hoverflies as they're approaching hedgerows and other linear features within the landscape, they'll turn and they'll start following those features. And by following, I don't mean that they're foraging on the flowers within the hedgerow. I mean, and clearly they do that. They'll follow the hedgerows and use them as a navigation guide. And the best analogy we've got for that is that's the way that light aircraft pilots often navigate around Britain. So, light aircraft pilot who wants to fly, say, from London up to Sheffield, often doesn't get a map out. They just follow the M1 and head north. And we think that's what's happening with these. Certainly, bumblebees do it, and some butterflies and some hoverflies as well. And Louise did some really elegant experiments where she placed out plants within the landscape at points where different numbers of hedgerows came together. So, where perhaps one hedgerow came in, she put a plant at the end of that, or where two hedgerows joined, or three or four or five joined at the corner of the field. And what she found was that the more hedgerow connections there were, the greater the number of insects visiting the flowers, and the greater the amount of seed set for those flowers. And so I think what it means for plant populations across Britain, where populations are often quite sort of fragmented, they're in small fragments, small patches around the landscape, is that if we can build in more hedgerows or hedge banks or linear patches of habitat, we might actually be able to increase what we term gene flow, the amount of genetic exchange between these fragments of these population fragments, and also the increase the amount of seed set for rare plants in particular.
What struck me, I think, reading the book, and also, I suppose, reading around the subject a little bit, is that obviously hedgerows are man-made, meadows are if not made, then managed. I suppose they are man-made to start with. Then you have things like bees like to nest in piles of sand and, kind of open habitats. And all of these things suggest that, and I think it's been written that the maximum biodiversity we've had in the UK came in around about, I think, the middle of the 1800s. I might be wrong on that, but I will look it up. So what that says to me is that actually pollinators are at their maximum when kind of activity by humans is at a maximum, or certain activities by humans is at a maximum. So is it fair to say that if we go back, a long time, and we would have been probably in this country mainly woodland, is it fair to say that pollinator numbers have kind of evolved alongside humans, and that maybe we've co-evolved together to benefit each other?
It's a really great question. And I've got two answers to that. First of all, we absolutely have no idea. We can speculate a lot, but we simply don't have good data on numbers of pollinators, abundance of pollinators, diversity of pollinators, beyond about the beginning of the 19th century. So that's when the real sort of scientific and natural historian study of pollinators really started. So prior to that, we don't have very much really good information. And even in the early 19th century, it's very fragmentary. There's one of the chapters in the book, actually, where I talk about declines in pollinators and so on. I start it with a poem called Wild Bees by John Clare, who was based in the part of Britain that I'm based in at the moment, Northamptonshire, and he was called the Northamptonshire Peasant Poet. And he writes incredibly eloquently and very in great detail about the natural history around him. And in this poem, Wild Bees, he talks about 4 different species of bees, which actually, from the descriptions, we can identify. 3 of those bees are still really common. One of those bees is now extremely rare in this country. And it suggests that when he was writing this poem, probably in the 1820s, that bee was much, much more common. But it's little fragments of history and little observations like that, which we're relying on to go even back to the beginning of the 19th century. So before that, we don't really know. But what my other answer to this is that actually it's a bit of a myth that Britain was completely covered in woodland before humans arrived. Actually, we know now. That used to be thought that was the case. But actually, we know now that there were open areas of grassland, and almost like more like a sort of a savanna kind of habitat, temperate savanna. But that was being produced by the large herbivores, wild relatives of cattle and of sheep and so on, that were wandering around in Britain at that time. So estimates of the amount of woodland cover in Britain before humans arrived vary between sort of 50 and 70% woodland cover, and the rest of it would be much more open kind of habitat. And of course you had wolves and lynx and so on, which were also affecting the behaviour of those herbivores, which again would have affected the structure of the vegetation there. So there's no doubt that now we have less woodland than we would have had, say 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. But whether we have more pollinators now because of that, I think not, because 70% of our country is agricultural, and we know that in a lot of agricultural areas, for instance, pollinator numbers are relatively low because of the kind of intensive agriculture that many farmers are using at the moment.
Yeah, I think I have read a lot of things about the woodland coverage, and I think it's quite a contentious issue, isn't it? I think it's argued either way. But talking about particularly pollination of food, obviously we are not managing things particularly in the favour of our pollinators at the moment. How damaging will it be from a food growing point of view if numbers decline further?
Well, in Britain, it's interesting that there are not many good examples of where decline in pollinators has affected food production. There are some good examples from apple orchards where we know that if in some apple orchards at least, if they had more pollinators in those orchards, they would have greater fruit set in the orchards. But quite often for apple growers, they don't want a maximum number of fruit. They want good quality fruit. And they're willing to trade off, large numbers of apples for better quality apples. But again, pollinators play a role there. We know that if there are more pollinators in an apple orchard on average, the fruit numbers go up, but fruit quality improves as well. The fruit are larger because there are more seeds in them. For some of the other insect-pollinated crops, things like field beans and oilseed rape and so on, I'm not seeing any published evidence that loss of pollinators is playing a role in their yields reducing. But I don't think we want to get to that point. We want to manage our landscapes to have as high a diversity of pollinators as possible, without getting to the point where we're suddenly really concerned about it. We know that pollinators and numbers have declined overall, and there's something called the precautionary principle, which says that you really don't want to get to the point where things have become critical before you start to take action. Climate change is a really good example of that. We don't want to get to the point where climate change is having a massive effect on the Earth before we start to take action. We want to take action now to stop that happening. And I think the same applies to pollinators as well.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting because you don't sort of scaremonger at all with the book, but you do, highlight the problems. And I think a lot of people would be interested to kind of find out that actually, I think a lot of people think that after World War II, we lost a lot of biodiversity in this country for various reasons. And then I think that you say actually the main period of species lost happened just after World War I. Can you just maybe touch briefly on why that was the case? Because I think people will find that really interesting.
Yeah, well, World War II certainly had an effect, but I think the point I'm really making in the book is that the main period of pollinator extinction in Britain, and we've lost about 23 species of bees and flower visiting wasps. But the main period of those extinctions started just after World War One. I mean, it continued through and into World War Two and just afterwards, but it started much earlier. And the reason was because during World War One we had the same sort of issues around food security, around not growing enough food in this country to feed the population, problems with imports and so on, and blockades by the Germans at that point. That all of that happened in World War One as well as in World War Two. But to some extent, we've kind of forgotten about that. World War Two is relatively recent history, but it's kind of receding into the past. World War One feels like much more ancient history because the generations that went through that have gone now. So yeah, it's. I think we've got to look even further back in time to see how things like changes to agricultural practice, intensification, and so on, have had effects over time. So you said that I don't scaremonger in the book, and yeah, absolutely. What my job as a scientist is to present the evidence and to interpret that evidence in a way that is balanced and nuanced and so on. And although I've got concerns about what's happening to pollinators in Britain and globally, I'm not going to stand on a soapbox and say all of the bees are dying and we've got to do something about it, which some of the environmental organisations are doing. And there is a phrase that I use in the book. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to use it on your podcast, which is the honeybee bullshit machine, which is, you can edit that out if you want.
No, you can absolutely swear on this podcast. It's fine.
Yeah, the honeybee bullshit machine is a phrase that I coined, which doesn't relate, specifically to people who keep honeybees and beekeepers and so on. It refers really to some environmental organisations that have ran campaigns around Save the Bees, or large companies and supermarkets and so on that have read these campaigns around Save the Bees and have misquoted statistics or made up statistics, or used the famous Einstein quote of if all of the bees on the planet were to die, humanity would only have 5 years left to live. There are various versions of it. First of all, it's not true. There are 20,000 species of bees on the planet, and honeybees are just one of them. But also, Einstein never said it. It was made up probably in the 1950s by someone who used a quote in a beekeeping magazine at a point where Einstein was at his most famous, and they wanted to say that Einstein said this about bees. And actually, he didn't. It's completely untrue. These are just sort of examples of this honeybee bullshit machine. Some people call it bee wash. It's just the there is so much misinformation out there, and that's one of the reasons for writing the book. Actually, was just to produce a more balanced and nuanced view of what is happening to our pollinators.
It's naughty as well, because I remember going to an industry event and there was some honeybee bullshit going around, and everybody in the audience was really loving it, and they really kind of thought that because they want to do good. And so if you tell them they can do good by doing this, then they can't. And these are industry professionals, like tradespeople from the world of horticulture and design. And they sort of thought, yeah, this is great. And like I say, because people want to do the right thing. And so they, it's naughty to kind of mislead people when they're trying to express good intentions.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's in a sense, it's almost kind of fraudulent. My favourite example is there is a website where you can sponsor a honeybee. It's an American website, and I think you pay $1 to sponsor a honeybee. Now, worker honeybees only live a couple of weeks, so what are you going to do? Are you going to pay $1 every couple of weeks to keep sponsoring them? I mean, it's just crazy. And actually, what's often not recognised is that, particularly in parts of the world where honeybees are not native, like North America and South America and Australia as well, honeybees can actually be a real conservation problem because they suppress the numbers of native bees and other pollinators. They, monopolize all of the nectar and pollen within an area. And that's something I touch on in the book. Some of us got real concerns about this growth in beekeeping globally. Honeybee numbers have gone up and up and up and up globally. Honeybees are not going to go extinct anytime soon, but some of our other bees and other pollinator species may well do.
Yeah, and actually I think that sort of ties into one of the other questions I had, which was that, I think ideally you would like to see a maximum amount of habitats to kind of cater to lots of different pollinators. But then obviously we have pollinators who are specialists who need very niche habitats and feeding sources. So, can those two things coexist? Can we protect one while trying to maximise the other?
I think they can. Yes, I think they can. It's a difficult balancing act to make, but what the big thing within British conservation at the moment is the idea that nature reserves have got to be larger. They've got to be landscape level. They've got to be connected together to allow species to move between them, and they've got to be appropriately managed. And appropriately managed either means humans going in and doing the managing, or the buzzword at the moment, of course, is rewilding. Adding beavers into landscapes and letting them effectively manage the watercourses and the landscape in that sense. If we have large enough nature reserves, large enough protected areas that are genuinely protected and where we they're not threatened in the future, I think we can accommodate both, a diversity of pollinators, including many of the generalists, like some of our bumblebees, and the specialists as well. They can find a place, a habitat, a niche within there. But there's lots of discussion in the conservation amongst professional conservationists, the Wildlife Trust and RSPB and so on, about how we can make our landscapes more wildlife friendly. And gardens certainly have a role to play in that, absolutely. Because we can't, humans are part of nature, and we can't dissociate one from the other. And particularly in a fairly densely populated country like Britain, people have to be part of the equation.
Yeah, and actually that's another really interesting experiment that you did in your book, which was measuring the pollinators that visited a particularly large garden. And I think that obviously there's Jennifer Owen's study that she did, going back, I think, to the 60s. So I did wonder, though, about the kind of the validity of measuring the amount of pollinators in a garden and whether we could take from that it was cause for celebration when actually it wasn't. Because in gardens, obviously, there are lots of different sources of nectar and pollen. And they're kind of like a banquet. They're like, I think I said, describe them as a McDonald's on an A road. They're full of food. And is it possible that we're measuring the number of pollinators, but actually all we're getting is just all the pollinators from the kind of local area piling into that one spot? And therefore, does the garden give us a true picture of the amount of pollinators in an area?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So that was another of my PhD students, Hilary Ehrenler, who did that work. And she, as you say, she looked at pollinator diversity in, I think it was 19 different, large country houses, big posh stately homes around Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire. So there are two reasons for us doing that study. One is that those gardens have been there for centuries in many cases. They're relatively stable parts of the landscape in this part of Britain. The style and the format and the type of planting and so on has certainly changed, but nonetheless they're relatively stable elements within the landscape. In contrast, the farmland around them that they often sit in has changed enormously in the last 100 years or so, with agricultural intensification, as we've discussed, great monocultures and so on. So it was really to kind of understand whether or not these gardens could act as ecologists use the term refugia. So refugia are areas where wildlife migrates back to in terms of sort of ice ages, for example. Species can move into areas that are not being affected by the ice, or a little bit warmer and so on. And then once the ice disappears, they then move back out into the landscape and recolonize. And so these gardens effectively could be acting as refugia for the future. They've got very high pollinator diversity, and when we start managing the surrounding landscape in a way that's more sympathetic to wildlife and to pollinators in particular, they can then move out of those gardens into those other habitats. Because actually, many of the insects that Hilary was finding in those gardens, they'll probably spend almost all of their life cycle within those gardens. Small solitary bees, for example, may spend their whole lives nesting and foraging for nectar and pollen within an area of less than a hectare. Some of the largest species, bumblebees and so on, can forage over kilometers, but the smaller species certainly are much more restricted. I think they are important areas, and likewise, gardens within urban housing developments and so on. Often we think that our own small garden probably can't do very much for supporting pollinators. At the moment, I'm looking out of bedroom window, and I'm looking at our own garden, and it's only 10 meters by 20 meters. It's looking a bit dreary at the moment in this weather. But our garden sits within a wider, Victorian development of gardens, which is much larger, and some of my neighbours don't do very much to their gardens. They've got a patch of brambles at the back, and they might mow the lawn once or twice a year. Others are much tidier and plant lots of annual flowers and so on. And at a landscape scale, if we consider this to be the landscape of the gardens, we're all contributing to that. We're all contributing to supporting not just pollinators, but birds and other wildlife here.
Which I suppose brings me to my last question very nicely, which is if you could give maybe a few top tips for people who want to encourage pollinators, and the things that they maybe could do and the things that they shouldn't do if they want to maximise the visits to their gardens. Could you give a few handy hints?
First of all, think carefully about the kind of plants that you put into the garden. There are many different types of plants which will attract pollinators. The RHS has a really good website called Plants for Pollinators, which has some ideas for what to plant in gardens. But when you're choosing particular varieties of plants, choose the ones which are single flowered, trying to avoid some of the fussy double flowers and so on, because often pollinators can't get into the nectar and pollen and those sorts of flowers. When you're visiting a nursery or a garden centre, and hopefully in the not too distant future we'll be able to do that again. When you're visiting those, watch out for bees and butterflies. Have a look and see what they're visiting in the nurseries, and perhaps make choices for what to plant in the gardens based on that. Other things you can do: try not to be too tidy, particularly in the winter. A number of our pollinators hibernate over winter, and they can find places to shelter. Then that's great. Other things. Try and have some water in the garden. Often small ponds and even very small dishes of water we know will attract different types of wildlife. But quite a number of bees, for example, need a source of water because they some of the mason bees, for example, use wet mud and wet soil to seal up their nests, and so there needs to be water, at least wet mud and soil within the garden to allow them to do that. Be nice to wasps as well. My final one. Wasps, get a really bad press, but actually wasps are really important pollinators, particularly later in the season. Things like ivy, and of course, if they don't pollinate the ivy, then there aren't berries, which then feed birds and so on. But also, wasps are really important predators within the garden. Take ranges of caterpillars and sawfly larvae and so on from ornamental and vegetable plants.
And if you're not convinced about wasps, go back and listen to episode 74 with Richard Jones and find out why they're so important to have around. There's a link to that episode in the show notes. A very big thank you to Jeff for the interview, and thanks to you for listening. Rather generously, the publishers have provided a discount code just for you, which gives you 30% off the price of Jeff's book. If you follow the link in the show notes or go to Pelagic Publishing's website and search for Pollinators and Pollination, you can use the code ROOTS30, all uppercase. Thanks as well to gardencourses.com for sponsoring this episode. And I leave you with Dr. Ian Bedford with a most appropriate bug of the week.
For most bumblebee species, the new queens that emerged the previous summer will have spent winter in deep hibernation. All the other members of their colony would have died. And so during spring, it'll be just these new queens that we see buzzing around our gardens, searching for nectar to replenish the energy that they'll have lost through not feeding for 6 months. After a couple of weeks, though, they'll be fit enough for the vital role that they'll play in ensuring the survival of their species. This begins with a quest to find a nesting site, somewhere protected from the elements and hidden from predators. Depending on species, this could be in a hole in the ground, within dry leaves under a hedge, or even in a bird box, or high up within the cavity of a tree. But wherever the queen chooses, they'll all begin following the same behavioural process. A process that's been undertaken by many millions of generations before them. The first stage of this requires the queen to collect pollen, which she mixes with wax from her body to create a mound within the nest that she'll lay a few eggs on. She'll also collect nectar that she stores in a wax pot that she builds next to the mound. Then, just like a bird, the queen will sit on her eggs, keeping them warm by vibrating her muscles to create heat, whilst feeding from the nectar pot to maintain her energy. After several days, the eggs hatch into little white grubs that begin eating the pollen mound. Then, as they grow bigger, the queen will maintain them on pollen she forages for from nearby flowers. The grubs then mature in a couple of weeks and create cocoons, within which they develop into the first batch of adult worker bumblebees, which are all infertile females. Their job is to now relieve the queen of her foraging work, enabling her to remain within the nest for the rest of her life, laying eggs whilst being fed and protected by the workers. As the season progresses, the colonies grow to their maximum size, yet rarely containing more than 400 to 500 adult workers. The queens, however, will soon be coming to the end of their lives, so to ensure the generations continue, they stimulate some of their eggs into becoming new queens, whilst others that had remained unfertilised develop into males. When these eventually hatch into adults, they disperse from the nest, leaving the maternal queen to die and the colony to end. Flying away to find mates, the males will also soon die, whilst the new queens will feed on late-season nectar, storing energy reserves that will help them survive through the winter hibernation and allow us the pleasure of watching them buzzing around our gardens again the following spring.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.